Norman, let it rip.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd love for you two to start with sharing what kind of miscommunicator are you or each of you, and how does that show up at the level of like the behaviors in the relationship?
Yeah. I can go first. I'm the misguided empath. And of all the different malpractices on there, the one that I tend to do the most is projecting. Um, Projecting is when I create a story about the other person based on history or based on like my own history, and I believe it before validating and checking in with them about it. And then I kind of go down like my spiral and create more stories and hard feelings and things like that. So that's me in a nutshell. That's my talk, that my worst trait. But like it's not a bad trait. I'm working on it.
Yeah, it's annoying to experience, but
Stay
you're
okay. I want to stay with that. Like, I want to
Okay.
hear
Grill me.
when you project, what does it feel like for you after you realize it, and then how does it received by Steph?
Yeah. Well, yeah, Steph can talk about the receiving part, but like for me, when I project, um, I'm in a place now in my life where I can usually tell that I'm creating stories. But sometimes, depending on how much bandwidth I have or how big the feelings are or how vulnerable I feel, I will let the stories continue to run. I'll let myself believe the projection and just fester in it, and like it, I feel protected in the moment, because I'm kind of like playing victim for myself or like trying to understand like right versus wrong. But then after I like it's also exhausting because I'm not talking to her about it, you know. I'm kind of expecting her to get it, you know. So yeah.
Well, I'll go into how it is to receive it. It's literally so annoying. And it is very frustrating. I don't know, like if any of you all have been on the other side of the projection, which is like, you know what they're talking about is like related to something else, right? And like not about you. And it's so obvious. And so I just struggle, I think, when I observe it, because my struggle is like, dude, I totally like it's really annoying, frustrating, but I also at the same time just hold the like understanding of like where it comes from, because like I know keto really well. I know it's come from like past behaviors that I've had potentially, or past partners' behaviors potentially, that have like forced or made him feel like he has to react in this way. And so there's a bit of understanding, but there's also annoyance. And so there's like kind of holding both at the same time, which is also in and of itself like such uh you know
It's
uh
hard.
yeah, it's just like it's like, who wants to do the additional emotional labor of like holding both, like this person's and mine, but like that's also kind of part of the work too. But yeah, that's how it is receiving it.
I think something really insightful for everyone else here that I want to like drill into is the fact that when Cato projects, it's not often out of malice. It is usually driven by some kind of unmet need. And so when the rest of you are looking at your quiz results and you're like, oh God, like that's what I'm doing. I hope you can look at it not as like you're a bad person, but like, wow, there must be something that I'm not getting that's that's leading me to do this. But there are different ways. And so I think what's really interesting that I'm hearing from both of you is that like Cato is learning to like self-soothe and like challenge his own stories before they fester and become like real. And then Steph is like doing some of the emotional labor of like holding that complexity of like it might be frustrating, but there might be some translation needed. So I'm curious how you two think about the limits of personal responsibility versus like co-regulating as
Yeah.
partners.
Yeah, I think we're exploring that right now. So I think I'll just pull on an example that just happened this weekend. I'll tell you all a story of like how I just did this projecting. On Sunday I was working out. I was at the park working out, and Steph was hanging out with her friend. And she texted me and she was like, hey, like I'm gonna make you some food when you're back from your workout. I'm heading home right now. Like I'm done hanging out with my friend. I'll see you soon. So I was like, okay, cool. Like that sounds great. And as I was walking back home, I saw her pulling in, and so like, but she texted me like a while back, like whatever. And but then by the time I got into the house, I just took note. I was like, huh, like, I mean, she told me that she had to go get gas because she had 5 miles on her tank left. And so like for me, like in that moment, I noticed the stories that started to surface. I was like, okay, like, well, you just said you were gonna like make food, but you didn't come home like like you basically like said you were gonna do something, but it's not happening. And to give you a little bit more historical context, because I just told you the story that happened this weekend, there have been moments in our relationship in the past where Steph said she would do something, but those planned activities wouldn't happen but because of work. So let's say she had to get off by 5. She said she'd do all those things, but she'd keep kicking down the can, and we'd start like 30 minutes or an hour later because she had to take care of work, but she wouldn't own up to it. So there's a lot of like historical hard feelings that I have that I'm afraid will repeat itself. And I have like an unfocused way of like scanning things, and I apply that lens through the situation that happened on Sunday. I was like, oh, like, she said she was gonna like make food, but she didn't come home on time because she didn't account for that. So like that is an example of me like some like really petty stuff. Like I had to let her know. I was like, hey, like I have these stories. I just want to let you know I'm I'm being petty right now, and I will find a way to work on this by myself. I'm gonna go talk to someone. I know I got problems. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of like how this stuff is still very real. Um, so yeah, Norman, you can ask a little bit more. Steph, you can share about how I was experiencing that.
Yeah, so the story I feel like that Kato had about me was like, oh, she's like irresponsible, or like she doesn't like uphold her word, or like I can't trust her, right? Which comes from like a lot of like different past experiences. And I think what's like challenging about being on the receiving end of that is because like Kato and I have had so many conversations about me getting better. And like how many of you like relate with like, oh my God, like you've had multiple conversations with a partner, with a friend, and like you're working on it, but like you're not quite there yet. Like you don't have that like really 100% like grade A like habits yet, but you're like working on it. So it's like hard because I know I'm working on these things, but then I'm still getting pegged for like who I used to be versus like who I am now. And that's the problem and the issue that I have with the way that he was projecting, because I was like, dude, that's not me anymore. Like legit, I literally had to go get gas. Like it's really not that big a deal, you know?
Yeah.
Like in his mind, it's like something that's bigger, which I think again speaks to like what Norma was saying earlier about, hey, like there's some sort of like unmet need here that like he has in this interaction. And so yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it was interesting because like logically I knew this is so petty. This is literally, I actually do not care about this. She literally had to go get gas, and I am not starving or anything, but like sometimes my mind kind of like if I feed into the story a little bit, and like it's like you light the fire a little bit, it just gets bigger and bigger. And I was like, hey, something that Steph and I set up was like, I'm gonna let you know if I have some stories. Just if my mood is a little bit off, I don't want you to feel like it's anything about you. Like just so that there is clarity there, so that she doesn't start feeling bad about like why is he kind of in a weird headspace? Because she can feel me, she can feel like when I'm off. Yeah,
I just
not
want to
perfect.
celebrate the humility and amount of self ownership that you took in noticing this pattern and to prevent it from escalating any further. I think the fact that you were able to communicate it with Steph, and even though it was like messy, it went much better than it could have, And so
Mm.
I think there's something really important, like especially for misguided empaths who have the tendency to read deeply between the lines, sometimes going down rabbit holes and into dimensions that don't, exist anymore. So like here, Cato is like reacting to something in the past that's not actually here in the present, right? But he's taking also the responsibility of looking at how he's seeing things and saying like, oh, I'm not gonna put this on Steph. I'm gonna get the support I need because we both know that this is something that I'm working on. I think that level of awareness and then taking proactive action is really important in terms of like the progression in moving beyond these kind of miscommunication patterns that some of you have like noticed in your quiz. And so it's a very messy process, right? It wasn't like, oh, I noticed that I project and so I just stopped doing it. No, like, it's not a clean process, but
No.
it's new decisions like this over and over again that become new habits, and therefore I think take away the sting and power of the malpractices that you might see in your quiz results.
And I think too, like, I mean, the original question that Norman was asking was like how you discern between like what you're kind of like owning versus like in which places do we co-regulate. And I'm just wondering, Kato, if you have any like thoughts, or like do you have kind of like a process figured out for yourself? Because one of the requests I made from you is like, hey, you need to like tell me these things because I'm not down to keep receiving this energy. And
Mhm.
so like, how have you figured out when do I like, involve, when do you involve me versus when are you doing it on your own? Because I think that's something that's very common for people to want to understand the
Yeah.
process is like that dance or that balance.
Yeah, I think first for me, I had to understand what's my pattern. And my pattern is like I usually hold things for a while and try to work through it by myself before I come to the other person, before I come to you. So to swing the pendulum the other way, I would start sharing more, and we would have to kind of calibrate with each other. If like, hey, am I sharing with you too many stories too many times, and this frequency doesn't work? Um, and we haven't really gotten there yet. We're starting to just build the muscle of like, let me just share even the smallest stories so that we can become stronger as a couple in squashing them before they become big boulders that end up in more of a catastrophe. So that's kind of how I've been approaching it so far.
What I'm hearing is that like there's like a agreement between you two that there's some work to be done individually and some work to be done together. And it sounds like for Cato, the individual work is to like process a little bit at first, but then the agreement is also that like when you have these even the little ones that are brewing, that you share them as soon as you can with Steph. And I imagine Steph made that request so that you can deal with it together instead of watching him spin his wheels.
Yeah. Watching him spin his wheels is the most annoying thing because I'm just like, dude, if you just freaking told me, we could have gone the last 2 hours without this like hectic energy, like an annoying like frustration. Because I tend to feel for my fellow highly sensitive people, like I tend to feel a lot of things like before like they're even said. It's like I can see it, I can feel the energy. And so even when it's not verbalized, I already know there's something going on. It's that like sixth sense type thing. Yeah.
And this whole dance is around like, at least for me, allowing myself to be messy and not have all the words yet, right? And it's like, am I willing to just say things and it may not even make sense, but like to just have a partner that can help tease it out and get more clarity on it. Um, and I'm really grateful that Steph can do that with me because not everyone is that giving. Um, because yeah, it's kind of like the Asian parent stuff. Don't want to get in trouble, like, or like get yelled at or be viewed as the bad person. Um, yeah,
Want to be a burden.
Mhm.
yeah.
big one.
Yeah, and a lot of like the stories too is like, if I play back the context on like how um she used to like work longer, the unmet need there is like I wanted more time with her, but I also wanted to support her dreams. And so like I didn't want to be labeled as someone as like not supporting your dreams or being selfish. And it was always like that dance. But then I always felt like if I didn't advocate for myself, what's gonna happen? So it's tricky stuff.
Yeah.
I think the root of a lot of the what we call as like malpractices in your miscommunication archetype are rooted in dilemmas. It's usually like you're caught between a rock and a hard place, and you end up doing the easier habitual thing that you might have learned somewhere, but is not necessarily the best way of communicating. Right? You just end up projecting because like you can't get your needs met, so you need security, and you're just going to make up a story. Right? It's easier to default to malpractices than to intentionally try something else. And so, in the 4 suggestions for each of the miscommunication archetypes, those are new decisions that you'd have to consistently make to start shifting out of these. And it takes 2 to tango, especially like when you're interacting with another person. We can't change these behaviors in a vacuum. So I think what's also really like rare and precious here is that like here are 2 skillful people that care a lot about each other and are willing to do that work for themselves and for each other. And so I think when we're thinking about like growth in this area, you can't do it alone. You have to do it with other people. And so I think that's a really like important thing as well.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out, Norman. So I feel like at this point, I feel like I can share a little bit about my archetype. Also, like, oh, I'll just use the same example that like Kato is actually speaking about to share with you how my patterns were like coming up. Because I feel like, it's so messy. Like these things like happen within seconds, like moments, minutes, right? And what we're doing is just trying to slow down like what's going on in that interaction. And so for me, I'm a constipated avoidant. And so specifically the malpractice that like kind of comes up for me is I tend to resign. So like I let it slide when I'm experiencing some level of disconnection instead of setting and upholding like my personal boundaries. And a lot of this just comes from like I wasn't really taught, I think, as a child to like speak up, like in my household, it was like, you just kind of like listen to the directions and like you follow the rules and you don't talk back, you don't talk back to your elders, like that's just not how it is. So I grew up with the bias towards like as some of you had mentioned in the chat too, like you grow up more listening than expressing yourself. And so a lot of my tendencies and habits are around like how can I extend understanding for this person, and like I have certain people pleasing tendencies where I will be like, oh, like I totally get where they're coming from, and like that's okay. Like it's okay if my needs like slide, and so like there's this whole thing about my entire life up to the last couple of years where I've really downplayed a lot of my needs and didn't really feel like they were worthy or enough to vocalize, which leads me to the resigning part. And when we think about resigning and choosing to let it slide, it's not that I don't know that there's something coming up. Like I now know because I can identify my feelings, as I mentioned earlier. I know these things, but I will still choose to not express them because mostly because I'm afraid, I think, of rocking the boat, and I'm afraid of um making things harder, I think, for other people, on behalf of myself. I have this like relationship with like selfish equals bad. Like, you should be selfless and like you should always give to people. And so in the situation with Cato, I think the example of resigning is like I actually felt the um annoyance like come up because I knew there was some sort of projection going on. We literally just talked about projecting like not too long ago, because this thing was coming up pretty constantly. And so we had talked about it, and like I could tell I was really frustrated because I was just like, dude, I was just trying to do something nice for you. Like the intention was there. Like, sorry I had to get gas. Like, okay, like chill, dude. Like, I was just so annoyed at him. But I did notice that I didn't actually like express it. Like I didn't actually say like, hey, like I just noticed you're in a situation right now, and like I know that you're processing stuff. I'm just gonna like take my space like while you do that, right? And just take care of like what I need to. But instead, I take in all of his stuff, everything he's talking about. I'm sitting there listening, and there was a point where like I didn't maybe verbalize it, but I'm sure Kato noticed it like in my face that I was like not happy with like what was occurring, right? But I wasn't explicit about it, and I wasn't like um communicative about it. And I think that's the thing here is like um I think some things can get lost in translation when we're not explicitly like sharing or verbalizing some things. Like we're making assumptions about what somebody may be experiencing or feeling. And so part of this is how can you own what you are experiencing and be proactive about communicating some of these things. And so yeah, my pattern with the resigning, like I am pretty passive. And so like I will notice that, and then I'll be upset, and I like just don't say anything, and then I exit the room and go fold my clothes. So that's what I did. I left and I went to go fold clothes, because like part of it is like um a mechanism for me to just like kind of like let go of the heat a little bit. But a part of it was also just like I was really sad because I was just like, why can't you just see that like I was trying to do something for you? Like, why are you just like playing off of this story? And like I didn't think that Kato had the capacity, I think, to hold that in the moment. And so using that understanding, I was like, okay, I need to exit. Even though I didn't verbalize it. So that's like one of the ways I think resigning like showed up in the example. And Kato, you can feel free to share like your reaction to that. We never even talked, we didn't unpack this actually. Because I know you knew.
No, yeah, I know. This is live. I actually want to hear Norman's reaction.
So the unmet need underneath resigning is often hurt.
Mm.
And a not sorry, not unmet need, but like the need for comfort exists, but it's shrouded in the hurt that she has in being unseen. Right? She's not being seen by Kato. He's seeing a projection of her instead. And so she feels disconnection from that. And so she rather step away than to tell him that I didn't feel seen and I feel like you dinged me for something. And that's a very hard conversation to have when both of you are in your own version of the malpractice, of your own version of the cycle. And it just takes so much patience for yourselves and each other to like reveal to each other, like, this is my toxic trait. What's yours? Like, let's learn it and like slowly learn to be with it. And so I think that's what I think is really important here is that like no one's perfect. We all have our things that we need to work on. And like Kato shared his, Stephanie's sharing hers. And so I think this is just like two like wonderful live examples of like what happens when a need is not met. It warps and contorts into something else that comes out or doesn't come out. And then it leaves the other person increasingly confused. So I'd love to now hear from Kato, like, what was it like to hear this live?
Yeah. I'm not surprised. I just feel a little guilty because, I know I wasn't at my best. And it made me think about like leading up to the story, or like when the story was starting. I knew that if I shared this with Steph, because we've had conversations about this before, that it would flare up her not being seen wound. For like, she is already working into becoming a new person. She does not operate that way anymore. and she is asking me to believe in her new persona and her new self. What I have to work on is to really like give her a chance, because there's just so much, I feel like there's just so much like history of wanting the time and not having it. So it takes time for that to unravel, but I still wanted, I don't even know if weighing pros and cons is the right way to think about it, but I was like, okay, like I can let her know about the story, even though I know it's going to cause a spike, or I can believe in the new version of her right now. But because my mood was already changing, I needed to just let her know right then, like I just like, it was just sometimes like there's no right way to do it, and so I think I just wanted to share that because it gets messy like that sometimes. Yeah.
Go ahead, Steph.
It ends happily though, so let me close the loop on what actually ended up happening. Because I mean I share this because both Kato and I's like past relationships, I mean this is stories for another day, like there's none of this was happening. And the reason why I want to close the loop and share what happened here is because I think there's so much value in seeing like, oh, how can a like healthy conflict or a conflict end in some level of connection, which is kind of like makes our brain go haywire, right? Because it's like, dude, if you're having conflict, like how can you possibly feel connected after, right?
Yeah.
Like seems like kind of like they wouldn't exist in the same sentence. And so I'm going to share sort of like my decision process and what happened when I was reflecting on the whole situation, why I ended up deciding to like talk to Kato. So like I was going through my own process in the laundry room as I'm folding all my clothes. And
A
I'm
lot
like,
of laundry, like
a
three
lot
weeks
of
of
laundry.
laundry.
Good thing it was a lot of laundry because it's processing a lot. And so, I was thinking about like what was happening to Kato and like a very prominent prevalent pattern for me in the past is and a story that I also have about myself is like I make it about myself a lot. And I think I've grown a little bit out of that in the sense that like I know it's not just as simple or like um it's too oversimplifying to say like, oh, I'm making it about myself, because clearly like there's sort of like the feelings of feeling unseen is very, very real. And at the same time, I also recognize that like, you know, I had a moment where I was thinking about what Kato was doing, and I was like, this projection is coming from somewhere, and this somewhere is probably coming from some place of hurt, like because there's something about his process or his experience in the past where he was not getting that need like met. And so instead of coming back and being like, oh, let's like freaking find a solution, which I know a lot of us like tend to want to find, I just decided, let me just like let him know, like I know it hurts, like I know like there's a lot going on. And so like that's what I did. I came back and like as like angry as I was like at him, I was just I'm gonna make this choice and I'm gonna like let him know like that's what I see. Like I know it comes from like a hurt place, and I know that he's like working on it, and I know he works really hard on it. And so there are many choices I think in those moments when we are processing these really difficult things, and those choices are like where the difference happens, like where the changes in your relationships happen, where the patterning gets broken. And so in that moment I just decided I'm gonna not I'm gonna find a way to still, feel seen at some point in this conversation, because that is an important need of mine. But in this moment, I'm gonna just focus on one thing, and that one thing is recognizing like how hard it has been for Kato to like be in this place where his projection is coming from. So that's what I did. I just like let him know, like I just gave him a hug and I was like, hey, I'm sorry, like I know you've been through a lot and like it's challenging and like it's hard. I don't know exactly what I said, Kato, but like it brought you to tears, so there's that. Like
Yeah, yeah. You said I think you said like you said something on the lines of like I can see that it's hurt you a lot or something like that, or you've been hurt a lot or something like that, something to that extent, and like just fucking like waterfall teared after that for like a minute. Like I wasn't even expecting that, and I just needed her to be able to. I didn't even know I needed to hear that, and so when she said that, I was able to just like my mind literally like flickered through all the moments where like I felt like I was making a compromise to try to like support in place of like the need of time and all those things, and trying to also be like the best partner I could be to support, like that it brought me a lot of relief. Um so I think yeah, like I'm so grateful that you were able to do that. I know you could have made any other choice. And I think what I want the group to know is like there can be so many choices that you make. And like because of the relationship and trust that Steph and I have, she was able to make that choice and recognize it versus like getting more into the heat of things, and I'm really grateful for that. But it's kind of like a dance in terms of like, yeah, I don't know if it's the right time to talk about the marble jar concept, but like we have a lot of marbles in the jar, Norman? Yeah.
Um, yeah, I was just gonna add, and sorry, when we talk about marbles in a jar, it's like, how, every time you like support each other and work towards something together, like that's putting another marble in the jar, right? You're just like collecting like positive things that have like occurred between the both of you guys where you like bid and are working on the relationship together. Every time there's something where it's like hurting the other person, you're kind of taking those marbles out of the jar. So that's what we're referencing, is like we have a lot of history and a lot of marbles in the jar, which creates a lot of trust, I think, within the relationship. And so yeah, I think, I want to add one last note before we pass it back to Norman. Like the decision that I made like in that moment, and I have to slow it down to explain this because I know if you are here and you took the quiz because you have the intention of changing your behavior and changing who you are, right, in your relationships. And sometimes, like, especially for me, like I'm all about being right. Like I was all about being right in past relationships. And like sometimes I would get caught up in that. And sometimes a decision like this, I would have judged in the past as being very weak. Right. It's just like, oh, look at you. You're like giving up. Like you didn't stand up for yourself. Right. Like this moment you should stand up for yourself. Right. But I'm just like, no, actually there's like complexity in this situation. Both of these things exist. Like Kato's experience exists and mine exists as well. And I think that's like the battle that I think many of us are going through, and sometimes judging ourselves for, when you're like changing your behavior and changing to this new person that you want to show up like in your relationship. And like, yeah, so I'm just saying that because like this decision I made to like slow down to like make this choice is just like grueling and like it was not easy, but it put like another point for me to like know, okay, like that's something that like I'm becoming the person that I want to become. And it all starts with like that awareness of like observation, noticing like these things. And so yeah, I just love that everyone's here because they're in that same place of like wanting to observe these patterns, wanting to understand how to do things differently, because yeah, it means a lot for you guys to like be here to be learning this stuff, even though sometimes I think in the moment it can be a lot of work to do. But just wanting to share that too.
I want to try and summarize something across both Steph and Kato's stories, which is basically in every moment you have a crossroad between acting out
Mhm.
and compassion. So in Steph's case, her acting out would have been to continue to seethe in her own righteousness and then get annoyed that her needs not getting met. Or she can just extend compassion to Kato. And then for Kato, he could have acted out by continue to feed the story, or actually bring compassion to himself, to tell himself that, oh, I'm hurting right now, and like I don't need to feed into these stories. And something that I learned from an incredible coach named Jerry Colonna is that trust requires trusting. Trust doesn't magically appear. It's actually the other way around. It's only by trusting does trust emerge. And so it's a deliberate choice. It is a risk. You are being vulnerable in the process. So Cato's version of compassionate, like self-advocacy, would have looked more like him placing trust in Steph, knowing that she's doing her best. And there's a chance that she falters. But he has to trust first and lead from that place as a new choice that he needs to constantly be making, so that Steph gets that need met of actually being seen and actually being supported in her new journey.
That's it, y'all. Woo!
Yeah, such a beautiful summary, Norman. Thank you for calling that out.